In 2003, David Paulides walked into the offices of the National Park Service with a simple request. He wanted the data, not an analysis, not a conclusion, not an interpretation. The raw data, the documented cases of missing persons within national park boundaries. The records that any responsible land management agency should have been maintaining as a matter of basic operational necessity. He was told the data did not exist in a centralized form. He was told that compiling it would require a research fee of $1.4 million. He was told, in the particular institutional language that agencies use when they have decided not to provide something, that what he was asking for was not something they were able to provide. He left the office without the data. He has been investigating the gap where that data should exist for over 20 years. That gap is the subject of this episode. Not the disappearances themselves. Those have been examined in earlier episodes. This episode is about the institutional architecture that surrounds those disappearances, about the decisions that have been made at various levels of various agencies, about what gets recorded and what doesn't, about who has access to what data and why, about the specific kinds of information that the agencies responsible for the American wilderness have decided not to track, and about what those decisions taken together suggest about what the agencies know and have always known and have chosen consistently not to say. The National Park Service manages 84 million acres of federal land. It employs over 20,000 full-time workers and an additional 10,000 seasonal and part-time personnel. It has a data management infrastructure that supports detailed tracking of hundreds of operational categories: visitor counts, wildlife populations, trail conditions, weather events, maintenance records, law enforcement incidents, emergency responses. The granularity of this tracking is impressive. Individual park units report data on species encounters, vegetation health, water quality, visitor injury categories, and dozens of other metrics that flow upward into agency-wide datasets accessible to administrators, researchers, and in many cases, the public. The NPS can tell you how many lightning strikes have occurred in Yellowstone National Park in any given year. It can tell you the population trend of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It can tell you the specific categories of visitor injuries by park and by activity type. It cannot tell you how many people have gone missing in Rocky Mountain National Park. It does not have that number. It has not compiled that number. When asked for that number, it invokes the cost of compilation, a cost that, for a data infrastructure of this scale, is not credible as an explanation. This is a choice. The absence of the data is a choice. It was made by people with the authority to make it. It was maintained through multiple administrations and multiple changes in agency leadership. It is not the result of neglect or oversight. It is the consistent, sustained outcome of a decision about what category of data the agency does not wish to have. The question is why. The Freedom of Information Act request is the standard tool for accessing government records that agencies prefer not to provide voluntarily. Paulides has filed FOIA requests with the National Park Service requesting missing persons data. The requests have been denied on various grounds. The data doesn't exist in the requested form. The cost of compilation is prohibitive. The request is too broad. Each of these denials is, individually, a standard bureaucratic response that FOIA requesters encounter routinely. Agencies deny FOIA requests for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the specific sensitivity of the requested data. What makes the NPS denials different is the pattern, not a single denial. A consistent, sustained pattern of denial for a specific category of data, missing persons, that the agency has no legitimate operational reason not to track. FOIA denials for genuinely sensitive national security information are understandable. FOIA denials for classified law enforcement methodologies are understandable. FOIA denials for data that would impose genuine operational burdens to compile from distributed records are understandable. FOIA denial for missing persons statistics from a land management agency is not understandable by any of these standards. The data should exist. The agency should have it. The reason it does not have it, the reason it has made the consistent choice not to compile it, is a question that the FOIA process was designed to answer and that the NPS has consistently declined to answer. This is not a cover-up in the dramatic sense. It is something more bureaucratic and more pervasive. It is the institutional decision to manage a category of information through the engineering of ignorance. If the data is never compiled, the pattern in the data is never visible. If the pattern is never visible, the questions it generates never get asked. If the questions never get asked, the answers never have to be given. The engineering of ignorance is one of the most effective tools available to an institution that has decided certain kinds of knowledge are more dangerous than certain kinds of not knowing. The government's relationship with anomalous phenomena is a subject with a documented history that extends beyond the missing 411. Research into the broader category of what official institutions know about the unexplained. The history is long and the documentation is scattered in declassified files, in congressional testimony, in the statements of former officials speaking in retirement, in the patterns of institutional behavior that become visible over decades of accumulated evidence. The CIA's Project Stargate investigated remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant or shielded information through non-conventional means from the 1970s through the 1990s. The program ran for over 2 decades, producing results that the agency found sufficiently credible to continue funding. When it was declassified, the existence of the program, the fact that the United States government had spent 20 years and tens of millions of dollars investigating a phenomenon that mainstream science regards as impossible, was simply noted and filed away. The Defense Intelligence Agency and the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program disclosed publicly only in 2017, after years of classified operation, investigated unidentified aerial phenomena with access to classified sensor data and military encounter reports that the public had no knowledge of. The program produced conclusions that, in the congressional testimony of former officials, suggest that the phenomena being investigated are real, are not conventional aircraft, and in some cases demonstrate capabilities that our physics does not fully account for. In 2023, a former intelligence official testified under oath before Congress that the United States government has for decades been in possession of craft and biological materials of non-human origin. His testimony was specific. His credentials were real. His willingness to provide it under oath, with full legal exposure for false statements, was itself significant. The testimony was heard. It was reported. It was not followed up by any official body with the authority to compel the disclosure of what he described. The pattern across all of these episodes, the decades-long classified investigation of phenomena that official science dismisses, the institutional management of knowledge through classification and denial, the occasional disclosure followed by the absence of follow-through, is the same pattern that Paulides documents in the missing persons data. The institutions know things they are not saying. They have made decisions about what to know and what not to know. And the gap between the official record and the actual record is the space where the most significant questions live. The specific government programs that have operated in or adjacent to the cluster zones identified in missing 411 research are documented in fragmentary form in various sources. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program directed some of its investigation toward locations with sustained anomalous activity, including the Uinta Basin in Utah, where Skinwalker Ranch is located, and where the concentration of multi-phenomena reports is highest. The National Institute for Discovery Science, which conducted the most systematic civilian investigation of Skinwalker Ranch, had connections to government researchers who provided technical support and, in some accounts, access to classified data that informed the investigation. The specific nature of those government connections, who the officials were, what their institutional affiliations were, what they were told about what the investigation was finding, is not publicly known. The NIDS research team included scientists with security clearances that were active during their work at the ranch. The specific classified context within which they were operating has not been disclosed. George Knapp, the investigative journalist who has done more than anyone outside the classified community to document the government's relationship with anomalous phenomena, has described in interviews what he was told by sources inside the relevant programs. He has described being told that the phenomena occurring at the ranch and at similar locations were known at certain levels of the government, that the knowledge was old, not a recent discovery, but something that had accumulated over decades of classified investigation, and that the institutional management of this knowledge was deliberate and sustained. He was not told what the knowledge was. He was told it existed. That asymmetry, being told that something is known without being told what is known, is the characteristic form of the institutional disclosure around these subjects, just enough to confirm that the gap exists, not enough to fill it. The gap is the point. The gap is what the institutions are managing. Former intelligence officials who have spoken publicly about anomalous phenomena, and there have been more of them in recent years than in any previous period, describe an institutional culture around these subjects that is consistent across their independent accounts. The culture is one of strict compartmentalization. People who know specific things do not know that other people know other things. The full picture is not assembled at any single level of the organization. People at various levels know fragments, enough to do their specific job, not enough to see the whole. This compartmentalization serves multiple purposes. It limits the number of people who can leak the complete picture. It makes whistleblowing difficult because no individual whistleblower has the complete story, and it produces genuine plausible deniability at most levels. The officials who say they don't know are often genuinely telling the truth about their specific level of access, even as the knowledge exists at other levels they cannot speak to. The result is that the official record is not false. Exactly. It is incomplete. The officials who say the agency does not track missing persons data are probably stating an accurate fact about their level of the organization. The missing persons data probably is not tracked at their level. The question of whether it is tracked elsewhere by other programs through other channels is a different question that the official denial does not address. One former intelligence officer, speaking to a researcher in the context of the broader UAP disclosure landscape, said something that is applicable to the missing 411 research in ways that the research community has not fully engaged with. He said, "The things that official agencies don't track are sometimes more interesting than what they do track. When an agency with comprehensive data infrastructure has a consistent blind spot in a specific category, that blind spot is usually not an accident. It's a management decision. And management decisions about what not to know are usually made in the context of what somebody already knows." He said, "You don't decide not to track data about a phenomenon unless you have a reason not to track it. And you don't have a reason not to track it unless you know enough about it to decide that tracking it officially would create more problems than not tracking it." He said, "The blind spot is the tell. In the missing 411 research, the blind spot is the missing person's data. The NPS does not track it because someone decided not to track it. Someone decided not to track it because they had a reason. The reason is the tell." The military's relationship with the wilderness cluster zones is documented fragmentarily in a way that deserves direct examination. Multiple witnesses across the missing 411 case histories describe, in the periods surrounding anomalous incidents, the presence of military or government aircraft in the relevant areas, helicopters without identifying markings, aircraft flying at night with unusual light configurations, fixed-wing aircraft conducting low-level surveys in areas not on any published flight plan. These reports appear in cases from the Pacific Northwest, from the Great Smoky Mountains, from the Colorado Rockies, from the Great Lakes region. The geographic distribution matches the cluster zone distribution. The timing, in the period surrounding major incidents or sustained periods of elevated activity, is consistent across independent accounts. The presence of unidentified government aircraft in wilderness areas is not by itself evidence of anything specific. Government agencies operate aircraft in wilderness areas for a variety of documented purposes: aerial surveys, fire monitoring, law enforcement operations. Helicopters without external markings are standard for some of these operations. What distinguishes the reports in the missing 411 context is the timing, the behavior of the aircraft, and the locations. Aircraft conducting standard survey operations do not typically hover at low altitude over specific terrain features in the middle of the night in areas where unusual events have recently been reported. Aircraft conducting standard fire monitoring do not typically approach locations where witnesses have reported anomalous activity and then depart without interacting with the witnesses. The aircraft in the context of these reports are behaving as if they are aware of something specific about the location and are responding to it, monitoring it, assessing it. In some accounts, apparently collecting physical evidence from it, before the witnesses arrive, or before the civilian search operations begin, or in the hours immediately after a disappearance, at the specific locations where the pattern concentrates. The timing and the behavior suggest not routine government operations, but targeted responses to specific known locations. Locations that the agencies responsible for them officially do not track in a centralized database, that they officially do not know enough about to need to track, that they officially cannot provide missing persons data for without a research fee of $1.4 million. The official record says, "We don't have the data." The aircraft in the middle of the night over the cluster zones say, "We know exactly where we're going." There is a specific category of information that appears in the context of the government's relationship with Skinwalker Ranch that is relevant to the broader question of official knowledge of the cluster zone phenomena. The AATIP program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, was revealed publicly in 2017. Its existence had been classified. Its activities had been funded through a black budget allocation. Its focus officially was on unidentified aerial phenomena. But the program's actual scope, as described by former participants and by the congressional testimony that has accumulated since the 2017 disclosure, was broader. It encompassed what the program called broad unidentified aerial phenomena, a category that included not just aircraft-type objects, but the full range of anomalous phenomena associated with UAP activity, including, in the accounts of some participants, biological entities. The connection between AATIP and the investigation of Skinwalker Ranch, a location whose anomalous characteristics extend well beyond aerial phenomena to include Bigfoot-type creatures, poltergeist activity, and other multi-phenomena events, suggests that the program's interest was not narrowly defined around aircraft. It was interested in the full range of phenomena that co-occur in high-strangeness locations. High-strangeness locations are cluster zones. The cluster zones, where the missing 411 disappearances concentrate, are high-strangeness locations. The program that investigated high-strangeness locations had access to classified resources and classified knowledge. The program was classified. The missing persons data from the lands where those locations are found is not tracked, and the connection between these facts, the classified knowledge of what is in those locations, the absence of public tracking of what happens to people in those locations, is the architecture of the information gap that Paulides has been documenting for 20 years. The gap is not accidental. The gap is managed. And what it is managing, the knowledge that lives in the gap between the official record and the actual record, is the question that this series has been building toward. The congressional hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena that took place in 2023 represent the most significant public disclosure of the scope of the government's classified knowledge about anomalous phenomena in the history of the United States. Former intelligence official David Paulides testified under oath that the United States government has been in possession for decades of craft and biological materials of non-human origin. He described a program of retrieval and reverse engineering that has been operating for longer than most living Americans have been alive. He described the deliberate management of this knowledge through classification, through the denial of the existence of relevant programs, and through the intimidation of individuals who sought to disclose what they knew. He testified under oath, with full legal exposure for false statements, after going through the proper whistleblower channels before coming forward publicly. The committee heard his testimony. Other witnesses corroborated aspects of it. Documents were referenced that have not been publicly released. Programs were named that have not been publicly confirmed. And then the news cycle moved on. The transcripts are publicly available. The testimony is in the congressional record. The questions that the testimony raises about what programs exist, about what has been retrieved, about what the biological materials are, and what they indicate about the nature of the intelligence that produced them, were asked and not answered. The questions were not pursued. The hearings concluded, and the gap between the official record and the actual record remained exactly where it had been, managed by the same architecture of classification and denial that has managed it for decades. The specific implication of the congressional testimony for the missing 411 research is one that has not been examined in detail in the public discussion of either subject. If the government has been in possession for decades of materials and knowledge related to non-human intelligence, if what Grush testified to is accurate in its broad outline, then the government's knowledge of what happens in the cluster zones extends beyond the management of missing persons data. It includes knowledge of what the cluster zones are, what the threshold zones are, what the beings that produce the encounter reports are, what the relationship is between those beings and the disappearances that cluster in the same geographic areas. If the government knows what is in those forests, if the classified programs have determined, through decades of investigation at locations like Skinwalker Ranch and through the analysis of whatever has been retrieved, then the decision not to track missing persons data in those locations is not simply a data management choice. It is a decision about what the public knows, about the relationship between what is in the wilderness and what happens to people who enter the wilderness, near the places where it concentrates, about the risk that the American public is not being told about, that the people who enter the national parks do not know they are taking. This is the darkest implication of the information gap. Not that the government is ignorant, but that the government knows and has decided that this is the category of knowledge that the public cannot be trusted with. Paulides says he doesn't speculate. He presents the data. He notes the gaps. He leaves the interpretation to the reader. This is the interpretation that the gaps, examined honestly, point toward. The government knows what is in those forests. It has known for a long time, and it has made the specific decision not to tell you. The missing persons data is not tracked. The FOIA requests are denied. The research fee is $1.4 million. The helicopters fly at night, and the classified programs know what they know. In the silence between the official record and the actual record, where the most important truths live, about what is in the wilderness, about what happens to people who walk too close to it, about what the threshold is, and what is on the other side, that the government has apparently already looked at and decided not to describe to you or to anyone unless you have the clearance. And most of us do not. The wilderness keeps its secrets. The institutions that manage the wilderness keep them better. And somewhere in the cluster zones, in the active zones, at the threshold where the dogs stop and the scent ends and the searched areas hold nothing until they don't, Whatever the classified programs have been studying for decades continues to be exactly what it has always been: present, patient, known to some, admitted by none, and waiting, as it has always waited, for the day when the gap between what is known and what is said finally closes, if it ever does. The pattern of institutional non-response to anomalous phenomena is not unique to the missing 411 context. It is a consistent feature of how American institutions, particularly federal agencies with direct responsibility for the relevant territory, have managed the intersection of anomalous phenomena and public land management for as long as the relevant agencies have existed. The history begins earlier than most people recognize. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the modern era of UFO research was developing, and as the first organized attempts to systematically document Bigfoot encounters were being made, the relevant federal agencies, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, were receiving reports from their own field personnel of anomalous encounters in the wilderness areas they managed. These reports were not handled through standard agency reporting mechanisms. They were handled by accounts that have accumulated over decades from retired field personnel through informal suppression. Employees who reported unusual events were told, with varying degrees of directness, that the events were not the kind of thing that went into official reports, that the person should be careful about who they told, that the agency did not have a category for what they were describing. The informal suppression was effective. The official record for these agencies contains essentially nothing about the phenomena that their field personnel were encountering in the wilderness they managed. The phenomena were real. The personnel are real. The encounters are documented in their private records and in the recollections they have shared with researchers decades later. The official record simply does not contain them. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It does not require coordination at a high level. It requires only the consistent application at every level of every affected organization of the same informal norm. This is not something that goes into the official record. The norm propagates. It does not need to be stated. It is transmitted by example, by the observation of what happens to people who violate it, by the cultural expectation that certain categories of experience are private and certain categories are official. The officials who say the data doesn't exist are often telling the truth about the official record. The official record genuinely does not contain it. The question of where it went, of what happened to the reports from the field personnel who experienced these things, is a different question that the official record cannot answer. It went into the informal record, the private notes, the conversations with trusted colleagues, the things that people carry without being able to put them in the file. The $1.4 million fee is the formal expression of the same norm. We don't have the data. We can't easily compile it. The barrier to entry for accessing what we do or don't know is prohibitively high. The norm is intact. The gap persists. The relationship between the information gap and the physical geography of the cluster zones has a specific quality that deserves examination. The cluster zones are not evenly distributed across federal land. They concentrate in specific types of terrain, old growth, complex water systems, specific geological configurations. They also concentrate in specific land management jurisdictions. particular national parks, particular national forests, particular wilderness areas. The parks and forests with the highest cluster density are also consistently the ones with the longest histories of anomalous reports. The Great Smoky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest National Forests, the Colorado Rockies, the Boundary Waters area. These are not coincidentally the locations with the most extensive histories of indigenous presence and the most specific indigenous traditional knowledge about the non-human presences of the relevant landscapes. The land management agencies that administer these areas inherited them from a process of dispossession that, among its other harms, disconnected the land from the knowledge systems that had managed the relationship between human communities and whatever else shared the landscape. The traditional knowledge of what the cluster zones are, why they behave the way they do, what appropriate behavior within them looks like, how to manage the relationship between human presence and the beings that inhabit the threshold zones, was excluded from the institutional knowledge base of the agencies that took over management. The agencies filled that knowledge gap with the assumption that the wilderness was simply wilderness, land with physical characteristics, wildlife populations, visitor experience considerations, nothing that their frameworks were not equipped to manage. The missing 411 cases are, among other things, the cost of that assumption, the assumption that the wilderness is simply what conventional science says it is, the assumption that the people who knew it as something more were wrong, the assumption that the knowledge that was excluded, the traditional knowledge of the threshold zones and the beings that inhabit them, was superstition rather than empirical record. The assumption has been wrong. The cases are the evidence, and the information gap is the institutional expression of the refusal to acknowledge that the assumption was wrong. There is a specific moment in the public discourse around these subjects that illustrates the information architecture most clearly. In 2017, the New York Times published a front-page story about the AATIP program. The story disclosed that the United States government had been secretly funding research into unidentified aerial phenomena for years. The story was sourced to insiders. It was accurate. It was significant. The response from the relevant agencies was a masterclass in the management of disclosure. The agencies confirmed the existence of the program. They provided enough information to make the confirmation credible, and then they described the program in terms that minimized its scope and its findings. They said the program had been discontinued. They said its conclusions were ambiguous. They positioned the disclosure as the revelation of a minor, completed program rather than as a window into the ongoing and extensive classified investigation of phenomena that are anything but resolved. The disclosure confirmed the existence of the gap. It did not fill the gap. It replaced official denial with official acknowledgement in terms carefully calibrated to not require further accountability. This is the characteristic form of official disclosure in these subjects, just enough to make the secret's existence undeniable, not enough to require genuine transparency about its contents. The 2023 congressional testimony by Grush pushed further. His claims were more specific. The under-oath context was more demanding. The implication of what he described, the decades-long possession of non-human materials, the active suppression of whistleblowers, the ongoing classified programs, was more difficult to minimize than the AA-tip disclosure, and still the gap persists. The programs he described have not been opened for public examination. The materials he referenced have not been disclosed. The follow-up that his testimony would have produced in any genuinely accountable institutional context has not materialized. The architecture holds. The gap is managed. The knowledge that lives in the gap remains where it has always been, inside the classification, inside the informal norm, inside the institutional decision made decades ago and maintained ever since, that certain categories of knowledge about what shares this planet with human beings are not for public consumption. Paulides asks for the missing persons data. The agency says it doesn't have it. The fee is $1.4 million. And in the classified archives of programs whose existence was barely acknowledged until recently, something that Paulides' research is pointing at from the outside is documented from the inside, with the detail and the certainty that only direct investigation can produce. In the language that the institutions use when they are speaking to themselves, rather than to the public, there are former Park Service employees who have spoken to researchers in retirement with a candor that active employment made impossible. Their accounts, taken together, describe an institutional knowledge base that is more extensive than the official record suggests. One retired district ranger described what he called the institutional memory of the parks, not written records, the unwritten knowledge that passed between long-term employees, the things that people learned over decades in specific locations and that they passed on to new personnel, not through formal training, but through informal conversation. He said, "There is a kind of knowledge about specific places that accumulates in the people who manage them over time. Knowledge about where the unusual things happen, where the searches go wrong, where the animals behave strangely, where the visitors sometimes have experiences that they come to the visitor center to report, clearly shaken, describing things that the standard interpretation doesn't account for." He said, "This knowledge does not go into any official document. It lives in the people who work the land. It is passed down in the informal way. The practical knowledge is always passed down. Through story, through warning, through the senior employee who takes the new employee aside and says quietly, 'Just so you know, this drainage here has a history.' He said, 'I know that kind of knowledge exists about specific places in the parks I worked in for 30 years. I know because I was the recipient of it early in my career and because I passed it on before I retired.' He said, 'And the knowledge I received and the knowledge I passed on was specific and consistent. The specific drainages, the specific elevation bands, the specific combinations of terrain and water and geology that produce the experiences that don't go in the reports.' He said, 'Every long-term employee in a park with that kind of history knows where those places are. Nobody talks about it officially, but everybody knows. This is the informal layer of the institutional record, the layer that exists between the official data, which is managed through the architecture of not tracking and not compiling, and the total ignorance that the official architecture implies. The agency officially does not know where the unusual things happen. The people in the agency know exactly where the unusual things happen. The knowledge lives in the humans rather than in the records. And when those humans retire, some of it is lost, unless someone asks and listens. and records what they say. The question that all of this documentation of institutional behavior ultimately forces is one about responsibility. Who is responsible for the people who enter the cluster zones without knowledge of what they are entering? Who is responsible for informing the public that specific areas of federal land have specific characteristics that make them different from the surrounding terrain? That the risk profile in certain drainages and boulder fields and water convergence zones is different from the standard wilderness risk profile? Who is responsible for the families of the missing? For the honest investigation of cases that the evidence indicates are not standard wilderness incidents? The agencies responsible for the land are responsible. The National Park Service, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the agencies with the authority and the resources to conduct the investigation and to maintain the data and to provide the information that the public needs to make informed decisions about the risk they are assuming when they enter specific federal lands. Those agencies have the informal knowledge of the specific places. Their long-term employees carry it. Their institutional culture manages the gap between that knowledge and the official record. And in that gap, the people who did not have the knowledge suffer the consequences of not having it. The $1.4 million answer is not about money. No one seriously believes that compiling missing persons data from the National Park Service's field offices costs $1.4 million. The $1.4 million answer is about the price of knowing, the institutional price, the accountability price, the price of officially acknowledging that the data exists, that the pattern is real, that specific locations within the federal wilderness have specific risk characteristics that the public is not being informed about. That price is higher than $1.4 million. That price is the acknowledgement of decades of institutional failure. The acknowledgement that people were sent into wilderness areas without information that the institutions responsible for those areas had and chose not to provide. The acknowledgement that the gap between the informal knowledge of long-term employees and the official record has cost lives. The acknowledgement that the management of knowledge about what is in the wilderness, the deliberate, sustained, institutional management through classification and denial and the engineering of ignorance, has served the interests of the institutions at the expense of the people those institutions exist to serve. That is the actual cost of the $1.4 million answer. And it is a cost that no agency has been willing to pay, which is why the data is still not tracked. The FOIA requests are still denied. The gap persists. The cases accumulate. The families wait. And somewhere in the cluster zones, in the active zones, at the threshold where the dogs stop, whatever the classified programs have studied, and the informal institutional knowledge has named, and the traditional communities have always known about, continues to be exactly what it has always been. Present, undisclosed, in the wilderness that the agencies officially manage and unofficially avoid understanding. The $1.4 million answer is free. It has always been free. The cost is not money. The cost is the willingness to say what is known. And that cost so far has been too high for the institutions, for the officials, for everyone except the families, for whom the cost of the alternative has been paid in full and continues to be paid. In the wilderness, in the cluster zones, in the silence between the official record and the actual record, where the most expensive truth in American land management continues to wait for someone with the authority to say it and the willingness to bear the cost of saying it. The data is there. Someone should compile it and follow it. Wherever it goes, there is a document that researchers in this field reference periodically, but that has never entered mainstream public awareness in the way its content warrants. It is not a classified document. It is not suppressed. It is publicly available in the way that things are publicly available when they are not indexed, not publicized, not connected to the other pieces of the picture that would make them significant. It is a report produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency in 2009 as part of the AATIP program. The report was declassified and released as part of the public disclosure that followed the 2017 New York Times story. Among the topics it addresses are what the program described as the medical and physiological effects of UAP encounters on human witnesses. The report documents a range of physiological effects reported by individuals who had close encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. Effects including altered perception of time, unusual healing or harm to tissue, changes in cognitive function, psychological effects that persisted for extended periods. The report treats these effects clinically and carefully. It is written by people who are documenting what they found, not advocating for a specific interpretation. But the effects it documents are recognizable to anyone who has read extensively in the missing 411 research and in the broader encounter literature. Altered perception of time. The survivors of anomalous wilderness encounters who describe time gaps, the children who are found in better physical condition than the elapsed time should produce, the adults who cannot account for the hours between the disappearance and the recovery, unusual tissue effects, the witnesses to close encounters who describe physical symptoms that have no conventional explanation, the lasting physiological changes documented in some extended encounter cases, persistent psychological effects, the witnesses who describe being fundamentally changed by encounters, the quality of certainty in their accounts, the lasting shift in their relationship to the wilderness and to the non-human world. The DIA report and the missing 411 cases and the encounter literature are describing, from different angles, the same category of experience, the same physiological and psychological signature, the same set of effects on human beings who have been in close proximity to whatever is producing the phenomena. The government has been studying those effects. It has been studying them since at least the 1970s, under the AATIP program and under the programs that preceded it. It knows what those effects are. It knows what produces them. And it has made the decision not to share that knowledge with the people who are at risk of experiencing those effects when they enter the wilderness areas where the phenomena concentrate. The $1.4 million answer is connected to the DIA report. The missing persons data and the physiological effects documentation are pieces of the same picture. The picture that the institutions have assembled over decades in classified archives that the public does not have access to. The picture of what shares the wilderness with human beings, and what happens when human beings get too close to it. The institutional architecture that manages the information gap has a specific vulnerability that the accumulation of public evidence and public testimony is beginning to exploit. The architecture depends on the absence of connection between the separate pieces of the picture. The classified knowledge of what is in the wilderness, the informal institutional knowledge of where it concentrates, the missing persons data that is not tracked, the FOIA requests that are denied, the congressional testimony that is not followed up, the traditional knowledge that is not consulted. Each piece, in isolation, can be managed. Each piece, isolated from the others, does not constitute a complete picture. The work of researchers like Paulides and of the journalists and former officials and field researchers and tradition holders who have contributed to the accumulating public record is the work of connection, of placing pieces of the picture next to each other and allowing the pattern to become visible. The pattern is visible now, not as a complete picture. Too much remains in the classified archives, and the informal institutional knowledge and the traditional knowledge systems that have not been fully documented, but as an outline, a shape, the shape of something very large that has been known about, in fragments, by many different institutions and communities for a very long time. The outline is the information gap. The information gap is the most honest thing that the institutions have produced about the subject, because it has the shape of what it is concealing. The $1.4 million answer has the shape of the answer. The FOIA denials have the shape of what cannot be disclosed. The classified programs have the shape of what has been found, and the traditional knowledge has the shape of what has always been known. Together, these shapes describe something large and ancient and present in the wilderness, something that the institutions know more about than they are saying, something that the families of the missing deserve to have the institutions say. The $1.4 million answer is free. It always was. The cost is not the compilation of the data. The cost is the honesty about what the data shows, and the willingness to follow that honesty into the territory it opens, where the official record ends and the actual record begins. In the wilderness, in the threshold zones, in the gap, where the most important truths have always lived, waiting, as they have always waited, for the day when someone says them, out loud, in a context that requires accountability, and follows through. That day has not come, but the shape of what is being concealed is becoming clearer. One FOIA denial at a time, one case at a time, one congressional testimony at a time, one retired official speaking carefully in retirement at a time, one researcher asking the question that the institutions will not ask at a time. The shape of the truth is visible in the outline of what is being hidden, and the outline is getting clearer every year as the architecture of concealment shows its age, and the weight of what it is holding begins very slowly to show through. There is one more piece of the institutional picture that deserves examination before this episode closes. It is the question of what the agencies that manage the wilderness tell their own employees about the cluster zones, not the informal knowledge that has already been described, the formal knowledge, the training, the briefings, the official preparation for working in the specific locations where the anomalous cases concentrate. The answer is nothing. There is no formal training in the National Park Service, the Forest Service, or any other federal land management agency that addresses the specific risk characteristics of the cluster zones. There is no official briefing that tells new employees that specific drainages and specific boulder fields and specific water convergence zones within their management area have a history of anomalous incidents. There is no protocol for responding to reports of phenomena that fall outside the standard categories of wildlife encounter, weather event, or visitor accident. The formal training prepares employees for the wilderness as conventional science describes it. The informal knowledge, which prepares experienced employees for the wilderness as it actually is not formalized, is not required, is not consistent across individuals or across time. This means that new employees entering the cluster zones for the first time do so without the knowledge that long-term employees have accumulated, that the wisdom of the person who worked the drainage for 30 years retires with that person, that the informal transmission of threshold knowledge is interrupted every time the employee who carries it leaves, and that the visitors who enter the cluster zones, who trust that the federal agencies responsible for the land have prepared adequately for their safety, are making a decision based on an assumption of institutional competence that the institutional behavior does not support. The agencies know more than they tell their employees. The employees know more than they tell the public, and the public enters the wilderness without the information that would allow them to make genuinely informed decisions about the risk they are assuming. This is not a small thing. It is not a bureaucratic oversight. It is a sustained, institutional, multi-generational failure to provide the information that a responsible land management agency should provide. The failure has a cost. The missing 411 cases are part of that cost. The families are paying it. The wilderness holds the record of it. And the $1.4 million answer is the price the agency has put on the public's right to know what that record shows. That price is wrong. The data should be compiled. The pattern should be documented. The traditional knowledge should be consulted. The threshold zones should be identified, and the public should be informed. People should be able to make informed decisions about where they walk, and the agencies that have managed these lands for a century should be accountable for the century of decisions that have produced the gap between what they know and what they say. The $1.4 million answer is a refusal to be honest about what is in the wilderness, a refusal that costs nothing to the agencies that make it, and everything to the families that live with its consequences. The gap should be closed. The data should be released. The truth should be said, in the language that responsibility requires, about what the wilderness holds, and what happens when human beings enter the places where the threshold is thinnest, without being told, what is there? The wilderness is patient. It has been holding this record for longer than any of the institutions that manage it have existed. It will hold it after those institutions are gone. But the families of the missing do not have the patience of the wilderness. They are waiting now for the honest answer that the data, if it were compiled and examined, would begin to provide. $1.4 million for the beginning of an honest accounting of what the wilderness holds and what has been known about it for a very long time by the people whose job it was to know and whose choice it was not to say. The answer is not worth $1.4 million. It is worth everything to the people who need it, and it is being withheld at a price they were never asked to pay, but are paying anyway, every day, in the silence, where the data should be. David Paulides went back. He filed more requests. He received more denials. He continued documenting the cases that the agencies were not documenting. He continued asking the questions that the agencies were not asking. He continues now. The data is still not compiled. The fee is still $1.4 million. The cases are still accumulating. The families are still waiting. And the gap between what the institutions know and what they say remains exactly where it has always been: managed, sustained, at the cost of the people who pay for it without knowing they are paying. In the wilderness, at the threshold, where the answer has always been free for anyone willing to compile it and say it out loud with the honesty that a century of institutional silence has withheld.